The air inside the Aspenwood Conservatory's main recital hall felt different today. It wasn't just the usual quiet respect for a place of music. It was thicker, heavier, charged with a kind of nervous energy. The room itself was a tribute to art, with walls of dark, polished wood that seemed to absorb the light and soften the sounds. Every detail, from the deep red velvet of the seats to the golden light cast by the ornate sconces, whispered of tradition and excellence. At the center of it all, on a raised platform, sat a gleaming black Steinway grand piano, looking less like an instrument and more like a shrine. And today, the high priest of this temple was present. Maestro Victor Kozlov sat in a plush chair just to the side of the piano. He was a man in his 70s, but his age did not soften him. If anything, it had sharpened his edges. His silver hair was cut severe and short, and his suit was a dark, impeccable gray. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were pale blue and piercing, missing nothing. When he looked at you, it felt like he was looking directly into your soul, weighing your worth. He had earned this reverence. For over 50 years, his name had been synonymous with piano genius. His recordings were considered the gold standard, and a single word of praise from him could launch a career. While a flick of his wrist could end one, the masterclass was a rare event, a privilege offered only to the conservatory's most advanced students and a handful of special guests. The audience was a sea of rapt faces, students holding their breath, faculty members nodding sternly, and wealthy patrons looking on with an air of ownership. They were all here to witness the master at work, to see how he molded raw talent into something perfect. The first student, a young man with a nervous twitch in his eye, played Chopin. His fingers flew across the keys with a speed and accuracy that was stunning. Every note was in its place, every dynamic marked perfectly. It was a flawless performance, a beautiful, crystal-clear sculpture of sound. When he finished, he bowed quickly, his eyes searching the maestro's face for approval. Victor let the silence hang in the air. For a long moment, after the last note faded, he didn't clap. He just steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. "Technically, it is adequate," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the hall. The word adequate made the young man flinch as if he'd been struck. "But you play the notes. You do not play the music." The left hand in the trio section, it was muddy. You were thinking about the next passage, not the one you were playing. Again, from the beginning. And this time, listen. The student, his face pale, sat back down and began again. The room watched, feeling the weight of the maestro's expectations. This was the process, a brutal, unflinching search for perfection that left no room for ego. Tucked away in a row near the back, Lara Vance watched it all with a strange sense of detachment. She wasn't a music student. She was a physics major at the university, allowed to sit in on the master class thanks to a professor who owed her a favor. She loved music, loved it with a deep and passionate part of her heart, but she came at it from a different angle. To her, a piece of music was a beautiful equation, a dance of frequencies and harmonies, a physical expression of energy and emotion. She had taught herself to play on an old out-of-tune upright in her family's living room. Not by practicing scales for hours, but by feeling the music. By letting her hands find the patterns, she didn't dress the part either. While everyone else was in formal, black or dark conservative colors, she wore simple, comfortable trousers and a soft blue sweater. Her shoulder-length hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and instead of a sheet of music, she had a notebook open on her lap, filled with scribbled equations and diagrams that looked more like they belonged in a science lab than a concert hall. She was an outsider, a ghost in this machine of musical tradition, and she was perfectly content to just observe. One by one, the students performed. One played with so much passion that she lost control of the tempo. Another played with perfect rhythm, but no feeling at all. Each one was dissected by the maestro. His comments always sharp, always technical, always focused on the discipline of the art. He was a guardian of the old ways, a believer in a strict path to musical enlightenment. And Alara, with her emotional, untutored approach, was everything he stood against. After the third student had been thoroughly critiqued and sent back to their seat with a look of defeat, Victor's gaze swept across the room. It was a slow, deliberate scan, like a searchlight cutting through the darkness. People sat up straighter, trying to look worthy. His eyes passed over rows of anxious students, over the stern-faced faculty, and then they stopped. They locked onto Alara. A jolt went through her. It was like being spotted by a predator. She had been trying so hard to be invisible. His pale blue eyes narrowed slightly, taking in her casual clothes, her notebook, her complete lack of formal musical posture. A small, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his lips. "You," he said, his voice suddenly cutting through the silence like a knife. Every head in the room turned to look at her. The one who was scribbling in a notebook? "Come here!" A wave of murmurs and sympathetic glances washed over Alara. Her heart started thumping against her ribs. This could not be happening. She pointed to herself, a silent question, but the maestro's expression was firm. He had seen her, and he had decided to make an example of her. Slowly, feeling 100 pairs of eyes on her, she closed her notebook and made her way down the aisle and up the steps to the stage. The wooden floor felt cold under her thin-soled shoes. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "Alara Vance," she said, her voice a little shaky. "And what is it you study, Alara Vance?" "Certainly not music." "Physics, sir." A few people in the audience chuckled softly. Victor's smirk widened. "Physics," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Of course. You are here to analyze the sound waves, perhaps? To calculate the velocity of my students' fingers?" The chuckles grew a little louder. Alara felt her face get hot, but she stood her ground, meeting his gaze. "No, sir. I just love to listen." "Good," he said, his voice turning hard as stone. "Then you will get a closer listen. You have been sitting there looking so confident, so sure of yourself. Let us see what your scientific mind has interpreted from the art of music. Sit," he gestured, toward the piano bench. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. The entire room held its breath. This was not part of the plan. This was a public execution. They all knew it, and as Alara walked the few final steps to the gleaming Steinway, she knew it too. She was a lamb being led to slaughter, and the maestro was the one holding the knife. The bench of the Steinway felt cold and unwelcoming beneath Alara. It was a different world from the warm, worn wood of her old upright at home. This piano was a masterpiece, a machine built for perfection. She felt like a clumsy mechanic being asked to perform heart surgery. The weight of 100 stairs pressed down on her, a physical force that made it hard to breathe. She could feel the maestro's eyes on her, a cold, analytical gaze that was already dissecting her, finding her wanting. For a fleeting moment, a wave of panic washed over her. Her fingers felt stiff, foreign. What was she even doing here? But then she took a deep breath, and a different feeling rose up inside her. It was a quiet, stubborn spark of anger. She was angry at his condescension, at the way he had used her. As a punchline, at the smug looks on the faces in the audience. They saw a physics student, a nerd, playing at being an artist. They saw an easy target. Well, let them look. She didn't belong to their world of rigid rules and stuffy traditions. Music for her was not a religion to be worshipped. It was a living, breathing thing. It was the storm in the sky, the ache in a broken heart, the joy of a sunbeam after a long winter. It was not meant to be locked in a cage. She placed her fingers on the keys, not in the perfect, curved position the other students had used, but in a way that felt natural to her. She closed her eyes for a second, shutting out the room, the maestro, the expectations. She just thought of the music. She had chosen Liszt's La Campanella. It was a piece known for its sparkling, bell-like notes and its terrifying technical difficulty. It was a showpiece, a vehicle for virtuosos. Act! The perfect choice, she thought with a private wry smile. To show them what a self-indulgent tantrum really sounded like. And then she began. The first notes that rang out were not the delicate, crystalline chimes the audience expected. They were darker, more insistent. The famous little bell theme was there, but it wasn't just a pretty sound. It was a warning, a tolling that echoed with a sense of urgency. Her fingers flew across the keys, yes, but it wasn't the clean, flawless flight of a machine. It was the frantic, beautiful flight of a bird caught in a storm. She pushed the tempo, then pulled it back, letting the music breathe and gasp. She lingered on a dissonant chord, just a fraction of a second too long, making it ache with unresolved tension. In a section of rapid octaves, she added a slight, almost imperceptible syncopation, a swagger that was pure jazz, pure rebellion. The music was no longer just a display of skill. It was a story. It was a story of a chase, of a desperate flight. Through a dark forest, with the bells of a distant church growing closer and more menacing, her body moved with the music, swaying slightly, her head bent in concentration. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was wrestling with them, shaping them, forcing them to tell her truth. A few of the younger students in the audience leaned forward, their confusion turning into fascination. They had never heard anything like it. It was wrong, according to everything they had been taught, but it was also thrilling. It was alive. But for the maestro, it was an abomination. He watched her, his face growing darker with every passing second. His knuckles were white where he gripped the armrest of his chair. This wasn't music. It was a violation. She was taking a masterpiece, a sacred text, and scribbling all over it with graffiti. The improvisations, the rhythmic liberties, the raw. Unchecked emotion. It was an insult to the composer, an insult to the discipline he had spent his entire life defending. He could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting, could see the flicker of intrigue on some faces. He had to stop it. He had to crush this before it spread, just as Alara was building towards the piece's thunderous climax. A storm of sound that was about to break over the hall, a hand shot up. Stop. The voice was not loud, but it cut through her music like a shard of glass. The sound died instantly, leaving a ringing silence that was far more deafening. Ilara's hands froze on the keys, her heart hammering in her chest. She was yanked, out of her world, and thrown back into the cold, judgmental reality of the recital hall. She slowly turned her head to look at him. Viktor Kozlov was on his feet. His face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at Alara. He looked at the audience, as if she were no longer worthy of his direct attention. "No," he said again, his voice dripping with a scorn so thick it felt like poison. "This is not interpretation. This is a tantrum, okay? A childish, self-indulgent display." He began to walk slowly towards the piano, his steps heavy and deliberate. "You have taken a work of genius, and you have cheapened it. You have disrespected the composer. You have disrespected this instrument, and you have disrespected every person in this room with your noise." He stopped beside the piano, looking down at her. Lara felt her face flush with a hot, stinging humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and vanish. But she held his gaze, her jaw set tight. She would not let him see her cry. He saw the defiance in her eyes, and it seemed to infuriate him even more. He turned back to the audience, using her as an object lesson. "This," he declared, gesturing at her with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is what happens when talent is left untamed. When emotion is mistaken for art, when someone thinks they can simply feel their way to greatness, without the discipline, without the sacrifice, without the work." He let his words sink in, the silence in the room absolute. No one dared to breathe. He had made his point. He had publicly shamed her. He had won. But he wasn't finished. He looked back down at Alara, a cruel, calculating glint in his pale blue eyes. He was going to break her completely. "You have the fingers?" he conceded, the words sounding like they were being pulled from him. "You have a raw, animalistic connection to the sound, but you have no control, no soul. Prove me wrong." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that she could feel as much as hear. "Play Batch, the C-sharp minor fugue from Book 1. Play it as written. Not one note more, not one note less. Show me you have the mind for music, not just the instincts. If you can." The last two words were a final twisting of the knife. He was betting she couldn't. He was setting a trap, and the whole world was watching to see her walk into it. The silence that followed the maestro's challenge was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It wasn't an empty silence. It was filled with the weight of his judgment and the curiosity of the crowd. Every person in the hall was holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do. Would she cry? Would she apologize? Would she run from the stage in shame? That's what they expected. That's what the maestro had engineered. He had built a trap, and the door was swinging shut. Ilara sat on the bench, her back still to the audience, her hands resting in her lap. The humiliation from moments before still felt like a hot brand on her skin. The echo of his words' tantrum cheapened, noise rang in her ears. But beneath the sting of shame, something else was stirring. It was a slow, cold fire, the kind that doesn't roar, but burns with an intense, steady heat. He had wanted to break her. He had used her passion, her very way of connecting with the world, called it a flaw. She slowly lifted her head and looked at the keys. They were no longer an intimidating machine of perfection. They were just keys, black and white. A system, a puzzle. And she was very, very good at puzzles. The Bach fugue he had chosen was a masterpiece of architecture, a mathematical marvel of interwoven melodies. It was the ultimate test of control, intellect, and clarity. He thought he was challenging her on her weakest point, her supposed lack of discipline. He had no idea that in his world of structured, logical beauty, she was more at home than he could ever imagine. This wasn't her weakness. This was her secret language. With a quiet, deliberate motion, she straightened her back. It was a small movement, but it changed everything. The slump of defeat was gone, replaced by a posture of calm, unshakable purpose. The frantic energy that had fueled her Liszt performance had vanished, replaced by a stillness that was far more powerful. She didn't look at the maestro. She didn't look at the audience. Her world had shrunk to the 88 keys in front of her. They were the only things that mattered now. From his chair, Victor watched her, a smug satisfaction settling over him. He saw the straightening of her back not as resolve, but as the foolish final stand of a cornered animal. He let out a soft, dry scoff, a sound meant only for himself. He settled back into the plush cushions, crossing his arms over his chest. He was already composing his final remarks in his head. He would speak of the dangers of undisciplined talent, of the necessity of respecting the score. He would use her failure as a lesson for these students, a cautionary tale to last them their entire careers. He expected a sloppy, emotional mess. He expected her to get lost in the complex counterpoint, to let her feelings cloud the precision the piece demanded. He was waiting for the final, definitive proof of her inadequacy. Ilara placed her fingers on the ivory, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a deliberate, almost reverent grace. Her touch was light, controlled. She paused for a long moment, the silence in the room growing so deep it felt like a presence. Then she began to play. The first notes of the C-sharp minor fugue emerged into the hall. They were not loud or dramatic. They were clear, pure, and full of a quiet, profound sadness. The main subject of the fugue, a simple, winding melody, was stated with such perfect clarity that it seemed to hang in the air by itself. There was no extra flourish, no emotional pushing. It was just the music as it was written. A few of the faculty members in the front row exchanged a surprised glance. This was not what they had expected. Then a second voice entered, the answer to the first subject, and it was just as clear, just as distinct. It was like listening to two people having a calm, serious conversation, and you could understand every single word each of them was saying. This was the test of a fugue, making the different voices independent, yet connected. Many pianists mushed them together into a thick, muddy texture. But Ilara's playing had a transparency that was breathtaking. Victor's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He leaned forward just a little, his arms uncrossing. This wasn't sloppy. This was precise. Impossibly precise. But it wasn't cold. There was a depth to it. A sense of longing that was woven into the very fabric of the notes. As the piece progressed, a third voice, and then a fourth, joined the conversation. The complexity grew, the musical threads weaving an intricate, beautiful tapestry. Yet, under her fingers, it never became confusing. Each melody retained its own character and its own path. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was revealing the structure, the brilliant logical design that Bach had embedded in the music centuries ago. It was like watching a master architect explain the blueprint of a magnificent cathedral, showing how every single brick and arch had a purpose and a place. The audience was completely captivated. The room, which had been so full of tension and judgment, was now still with a different kind of awe. People leaned forward in their seats, their mouths slightly open. The students who had looked on with pity or scorn now stared with wide-eyed wonder. They were not just hearing a performance. They were being given a lesson in musical architecture, delivered by the most unlikely of teachers. They were hearing the fugue, as if for the first time, and on his chair the maestro was no longer a smug judge. He was a student. His face had lost all its arrogance, replaced by an expression of intense, bewildered concentration. He was no longer listening for flaws. He was trying to understand. He was trying to figure out how she was doing it. How was she achieving such perfect clarity while still conveying such deep emotion? How was her technique so flawless it became invisible, leaving only the pure, unadulterated soul of the music? He, the master of discipline, was witnessing a form of control he had never even conceived of, a control born not from rigid training, but from a profound, innate understanding of the music's very structure. He had underestimated her, and as the complex, beautiful voices of the fugue filled the hall, he was just beginning to realize how big his mistake had been. The music continued to pour from the Steinway, a river of intricate, interwoven melodies. It was no longer just a performance. It was an act of revelation. Ilara was not just playing the four voices of the fugue. She was giving each one a life, a personality. There was a quiet, questioning voice, a solemn, answering voice, a voice that sighed with a deep, ancient weariness, and another that sparkled with a flicker of hope. They danced around each other, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always with a stunning, logical clarity. It was like watching a master weaver at a loom, taking four separate colored threads and creating a single, breathtaking tapestry where you could still see every individual thread perfectly placed. The complexity was immense, a mathematical puzzle of the highest order. But under her hands it felt as simple and natural as breathing. For the maestro, the world was tilting on its axis. He had spent his entire life teaching students to build a wall between their technical skill and their emotional expression. You mastered the technique first, he always said, until it becomes second nature. Only then can you allow a controlled, measured amount of feeling to color the performance. But Ilara was doing the impossible. She was fusing them. Her technique was not a cage for the emotion, it was the very source of it. The precision of her phrasing, the perfect balance between the voices, these were not just technical achievements. They were the emotion. The clarity was the sadness. The flawless structure was the sense of longing. He suddenly felt like a man who had only ever seen black and white, and was now, for the first time, seeing color. He had always called her approach scientific, and now he understood what that meant. She wasn't analyzing the music from the outside. She was expressing its fundamental laws, its physics of harmony and tension with every fiber of her being. And in that pure, unadulterated expression, there was more soul than in 1,000 of his own disciplined, theatrical performances. His body had betrayed his mind's struggle. He was no longer leaning back in his chair, a figure of judgment. He was perched on the very edge of it, his entire body coiled with tension. His hands, which had been resting calmly on his lap, were now clenched into fists. His mouth, which had been set in a firm, arrogant line, was now slightly agape. His eyes, which had been so cold and critical, were wide with a dawning, terrifying awe. He wasn't hearing a student play Bach anymore. He was hearing Bach himself, speaking through this strange, brilliant girl from the back of the hall. He was hearing a truth so pure and so powerful that it was dismantling everything he thought he knew. On the bench, Lara was completely lost in the sound. The room, the maestro, the hundreds of Isit had all faded away. There was only her and the music. It was a feeling she knew well, a state of perfect flow where time seemed to bend and her hands moved with a will of their own. She wasn't thinking about the notes or the technical challenges. She was simply following the path that Baca had laid out, a path that felt as familiar to her as the constellations in the night sky. Her body was still, except for her arms and hands, which moved with a fluid, economical grace. There was no wasted motion, no dramatic flourish. Every movement had a purpose, a direct line from her heart to the keys. She was not performing for an audience. She was in a conversation with a genius who had been dead for nearly 300 years. The fugue began to build towards its final powerful climax. The four voices, which had been conversing so politely, began to overlap more and more, creating a dense, rich texture of sound that could easily have become a muddy mess in lesser hands. But in Alara's playing, it was like looking into a kaleidoscope. The patterns shifted and changed, growing more and more intricate. But you could always see the individual pieces of colored glass, each one shining with its own light. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. It was like watching a storm gather on the horizon, the air growing heavy and still, waiting for the thunder to break. A young man in the third row, a pianist who had been praised by the maestro himself, found he was holding his breath without realizing it, his heart pounding in his chest. Then the climax came. It was not a crash of sound, but a sudden, breathtaking surge of harmony that filled the hall like a tidal wave. For a moment, all the complex lines merged into one single, devastatingly beautiful chord that seemed to contain all the sadness and hope of the world. It was the answer to all the questions the fugue had asked. It was the resolution to all the tension. Alara held it for a fraction of a second longer than written, a tiny, audacious act that made the chord feel like it was hanging in the air by a thread, shimmering with unbearable emotion. And then, silence. The final chord faded, but the sound did not disappear. It seemed to be absorbed into the walls, the floor, the very souls of the people listening. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was packed with the echo of what they had just heard. It was a heavy, sacred silence, a space where no one dared to be the first to break the spell. 10 seconds passed, 15, 20. It was the longest, most profound silence the Aspenwood Conservatory had ever known. Then a sound. It was an older woman in the front row, a patron of the arts who had heard every great pianist of the last 50 years. She let out a single, quiet sob. That was all it took. The spell was broken. The room erupted. It was not the polite, measured applause of a classical music audience. It was an explosion. A roar of sound that came from a place of pure, uncontrolled emotion. People were on their feet, shouting brava and amazing. The students were clapping with a frantic energy, not just for Alara, but for the new world of possibilities she had just shown them. The sound was a physical force, a wave of appreciation and disbelief that washed over the stage, but through it all, one person remained silent. Maestro Viktor Kozlov had not moved. He was still perched on the edge of his chair, his fists still clenched, his eyes still fixed on the young woman at the piano. He didn't hear the applause. He didn't see the standing ovation. He was lost in the wreckage of his own pride, floating in the vast, beautiful space of the revelation. He had come here today to teach a lesson, and in the end, he was the only one who had truly learned. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a warm, vibrating force that pressed in on Alara from all sides. She sat frozen on the piano bench, her fingers still resting on the keys. As if the music were a current she was still caught in, the world slowly came back into focus. The blur of lights resolved into the ornate sconces on the walls. The sea of noise became the sound of individual people clapping, shouting, some even wiping tears from their eyes. They were on their feet, a forest of bodies swaying with a shared, powerful emotion. It was for her. The thought was so overwhelming, it was almost frightening. She had never sought attention, never craved the spotlight. She played because she had to, because the music was inside her and needed a way out. To have it received like this was a joy so intense, it felt like pain. A shy, awkward smile touched her lips as she slowly stood up and gave a small, hesitant bow. She felt like an imposter, physicist who had accidentally stumbled into a fairy tale. But through the storm of applause, one figure remained an island of stillness. Maestro Viktor Kozlov. The applause seemed to flow around him, unable to touch him. He was still in his chair, but the man who had been sitting there an hour ago was gone. The arrogant god, the unyielding judge, the master of his domain, all of it, had shattered. In its place was just an old man, looking lost and profoundly shaken. The wreckage of his pride was all around him, scattered in the silence of his own mind. He had built a career, a life, on a set of unbreakable rules. Discipline over emotion. Technique over feeling. The score as sacred text. And in the span of 10 minutes, this girl, this self-taught physicist, had not just broken his rules, she had shown him that the rules themselves were a cage. She had been playing in a world of freedom he hadn't even known existed. He saw it all now with a painful, blinding clarity. The other students, the ones he had praised, they were technicians. They were brilliant, skilled artisans who could build a perfect, beautiful replica of a masterpiece. But Ilara? Ilara was the artist. She hadn't just built the replica. She had shown them why the original was a masterpiece in the first place. She had gone beyond the notes on the page and found the living, breathing soul of the music. And she had done it with a control, a discipline of a different kind, that was far beyond anything he had ever taught or achieved. He had mistaken her freedom for a lack of control, not realizing that true control was not about holding on tight, but about understanding something so deeply that you could let it fly. The weight of his own arrogance, his condescension, his public cruelty came crashing down on him. He had not just been wrong. He had been a fool. A small, foolish old man who had tried to put the ocean in a teacup. The applause began to subside as people noticed the maestro's strange stillness. A hush started to fall over the hall, a ripple of quiet that spread from the front rows to the back. What was he doing? Why wasn't he saying anything? They expected him to stand, to say something, to acknowledge the miracle they had all witnessed. But he just sat there, staring at the stage, at the young woman who had just dismantled his entire world. Then slowly, he moved. He pushed himself up from his chair, his movements stiff, as if he were 100 years old. A gasp went through the audience. He began to walk. He didn't go to the podium to make a speech. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the piano. Every step was an effort, a surrender. The legendary maestro, the man who commanded the room with a glance, now looked smaller, more human. His face was a mask of conflicting emotion, shock, humility, and a deep gnawing awe. He ignored the audience completely. His eyes were locked only on Ilara. He reached the stage and climbed the 3 steps, his hand gripping the railing for support. He walked across the polished wooden floor and stopped beside the piano. He didn't look at her with anger or even with apology. He looked at her with the pure, simple need of a student who has just seen a truth he doesn't understand. Ilara watched him approach, her heart starting to beat a little faster again. She braced herself for another cutting remark, for some final, desperate attempt to regain control. But when he stopped in front of her, she saw none of that in his eyes. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness where his pride used to be. He didn't offer a flowery apology. He didn't make a grand speech. He did something far more profound. He gestured with a trembling hand toward the piano bench. A gesture of unprecedented respect that made the audience hold its breath. Again, he said, his voice quiet and rough with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't a command. It was a request. Plea. Play the opening subject. Slower. I need to understand. How you found the voice in the silence. The room was so silent you could have heard a pin drop. This was the ultimate surrender. The master was asking the student to teach him. He was admitting in front of everyone that he had something to learn. Ilara looked at him. At the legendary maestro standing before her, stripped of all his arrogance, she saw not a tyrant, but a man who had just been given the greatest gift of his life, the chance to learn something new. A small, triumphant, yet gentle smile touched her lips. She didn't say a word. She just nodded and sat back down on the bench. She placed her fingers on the keys. And for the 3rd time that day, she began to play. It was just the opening phrase of the Bach fugue, a few simple notes. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a challenge. It was a quiet, intimate conversation between two people at a piano. She played it slowly as he had asked, and in those few notes, she showed him everything. She showed him how the space between the notes was as important as the notes themselves. She showed him how the quiet tension held more emotion than the loudest chord. She showed him the voice in the silence, and the maestro listened. He leaned in, his head close to hers, his eyes closed. He wasn't analyzing the fingering or the dynamics. He was just listening. For the first time in a very long time, Maestro Viktor Kozlov wasn't a teacher. He wasn't a legend. He was just a man listening to music. And he was finally beginning to hear.